which is the endocrine. Sure, that's this one here. Sure, okay. So this one, endocrine system, and the endocrine system is a system that produces the chemical or proteins. Basically, it's like it's not necessarily protein, because we will learn that there are basically two types of hormone, produce hormone chemicals, two types of hormone. One is called steroid hormone. The other one is non-steroid hormone. And this hormone circulates in the blood. So it's something, it's very much like a body-produced drug or messenger that is not injected, but produced by our body, by this unique, very small organ, several organs actually, and they produce specific hormone circulate in the blood. Each one has like a life cycle for about a week, and they target their organ. So they travel and target their organ. So that's the endocrine system. So the major endocrine system include these several like organs. Hypothalamus, this one is very, hypo means lower. Thalamus is the center part of the brain. Hypothalamus located underneath the thalamus. And this is the neuron, but also the endocrine system. So most of the neuron produce neurotransmitter. So they release this neurotransmitter to the synaptic space and binds on the postsynaptic side. So that travel is very short, and they don't stay there for a long time. So they release, transport, and they got degraded. But the hormone is different. Hormone release into the blood, and then they circulate in our body for several days. Usually several days. Depends on the hormone. So hypothalamus, pineal gland is also very small endocrine organ in our brain. So this one produces melatonin. This one, the melatonin is to adjust our sleep cycle. Pituitary gland is very lower portion of the brain. So this portion these three are in the brain. And here we also have thyroid, parathyroids. So that's right here, is almost visible. If the people have, it's called goiter. If that's enlarged, you can probably see it. Usually in the old day, that when I was in Taiwan, that poor, place, people may have a enlarged goiter due to a lack of iodine. So if there's low iodine in the food, people may develop goiter, and because that's it caused the hypothyroidism. So, but now in America, this is almost not, we won't see people like that. So in America, if you see the goiter, like thyroid enlargement, it's not due to the iodine deficiency, but could be due to several other things. A lot of female develop this multi-nodule in the thyroid. And it's not tumor, but it's enlarged. And also down here we have, so thyroid, parathyroid produce parathyroid hormone. This one control the calcium amount in the body. So this is not as T3 and T4 that important, but it's also important. Adrenal glands. Adrenal glands include the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Pancreas include the endocrine system and the digestive system. ovary and the testes are the reproductive organs. So these are the endocrine system. A common thing, although they are very diffused in different locations, it's not like heart in one location, brain in one location, lung in one location. This one has different location, but one thing in common is that they produce, each one of these produce this hormone. And one thing in common is that these hormones circulate in the blood. So that's their function, to produce this hormone, circulate in the blood. So you may hear that endocrine, sometimes you may hear that paracrine produce this hormone to affect the neighboring cells. Autocrine is that this organ produce this hormone to affect itself. So that's autocrine, affects the same cells. Same cell produce and affects the same cells. Do you guys remember one example about that? Autocrine? That's
insulin or something?
The
pancreas? No, okay, insulin goes into the blood. Okay,
yeah.
Nothing about. I'm not sure.
Okay. Platelet is one example. Platelet can produce the hormone, and that can act on itself to make it produce more this ADP and thromboxane, and that make the platelet become very active and start to aggregate together. So we have these three terms. In the build that we only mentioned about endocrine, just something you can keep in mind that there's endocrine, there is autocrine, and there is paracrine. Autocrine affects itself, paracrine affects the neighbors, the endocrines release into the blood, circulating in the blood. So we will start by talking about, so in this topic, we will focus on hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroids, adrenal cortex, and pancreas. So that's our focus. So in the beginning, we will talk about the brain, the center of this endocrine system, hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So this is location, this is brain. In here, in the center part, right here is the thalamus. Underneath here, this one is hypothalamus, pituitary gland. So this is very underneath of the brain. When you look at this brain structure, this portion is kind of like all animal have like have this portion. Human developed this cerebral cortex to make us able to do some intelligent things. So this portion is more like limbic system to control our basic like instinct or our maintain our life. So this is hypothalamus, pituitary glands. Before talking about the hypothalamus, let's talk about the pituitary gland first. The reason is that this is an easier way to say it. So pituitary glands has two lobes. Okay, so that's very important, two lobes. It's called anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. So here is the anterior lobe, and here is the posterior lobe. So that's the pituitary glands. And among these two, this posterior is way easier. This anterior is very more complicated, but posterior is way easier. So the posterior part, so let's start by the easiest one. So posterior part. Posterior part is that here is the thalamus. So this portion is thalamus. This is the ventricle. This portion is thalamus. In the thalamus, these are neuronal cells. So we have the neuronal cells, cell body, and the axon. Remember cell body, axon? All right. So axon cell body produce this protein, and the protein can travel along the axon. So what's the mechanism to transport vesicles from cell body to the axon terminal?
Injury?
Active transport.
Active transport. Who say that?
Tiffany. It's me.
Tiffany?
3
Yeah.
points. 3 points.
30 points.
Yeah. Yeah, axon transport. Thank you. You made me proud. Let me write it down.
Yeah, good.
All
Yeah,
right.
give her 30. Give her 30.
So that axon transport, and so the protein produced in the cell packed in the vesicles travel all the way through the axon toward the axon terminal. Then it releases into the blood, and so that is the hormone produced into this from this posterior pituitary gland. So this hormone, we have two hormones. One is the ADH. It's called the anti-diuretic hormone. The other one is oxytocin. So only these two, very simple, only these two. But these two posterior hormone, only these two, ADH and oxytocin. And the thing you need to know is that these two is produced from the hypothalamus and travel all the way down to the pituitary and get released into the posterior pituitary glands. So that's these two. And showing you on this one here again. So here is the hypothalamus. This is the pituitary glands. And so that transportation is long. Their production is in the hypothalamus. Their release is in the pituitary glands. And it's not a lot, only these two, ADH and oxytocin. Let's get some idea about what are these two hormones. So ADH, we actually talked about it earlier. ADH is also called vasopressin, so it can cause the blood vessel constriction. ADH, the ADH anti-diuretic hormone, the major function is to retain water in the kidney. So it's released from the posterior pituitary gland, and it acts on the blood vessel, causes vasoconstriction, and also acts on the kidney to retain the water. So when the vessel is restrained, okay, when the vessel is restrained, then we will have the vessel become smaller, and that will lead to the TPR increase, TPR, total peripheral resistance increase. When water is retained in the body, this water will flow through the vein to the heart, cause the venous return increase, cause the stroke volume increase, so the cardiac output increase, so still increase. And overall, these two, we will have TPR, CO times TPR. Do you guys remember what's this equation?
MAP.
MEP.
The MEP, that's correct, mean blood pressure. Mean blood pressure. So the function of ADH can cause the blood pressure increase. And this is not like try to make you high blood pressure. The reason is that this one release is because your blood pressure is too low. and so ADH has a function to cause that. So here's a kidney that where we retain, for example, that kidney produce the urine, we will basically pee out. But when the condition that we need water, because water is precious, that we walk all the way to the river to get water or to the well to get water, going back home, and we pee out, it's kind of wasting. If we need those water, then we need to retain it in the body. So that's what's the function of the ADH. So ADH is very, is a hormone that's very universal throughout almost all animals. Almost all land animals has high amount of ADH, because not everybody, we are not like a fish, we live in the ocean that we have water all around us. We are living in the land, so we need to control how much water we waste, we lose from our body. So this is the, here we have the nephron. Nephron here produce this filter. So this is the plasma, the blood fluid will be filtered, and when it's filtered, this water will be pee out if we don't have any control. And when it pee out, basically it's right here. It will, when it's out of this tubule, so this is nephron. When it's out of this tubule, it basically just going back to here to be collected and pee out. We have no control. So we need to, if we really need to keep those water in the body, in the situation that we are thirst, in the situation that we don't have enough water, then ADH will pump this water back to, here is water pump, or pump this water back to our body and prevent it from peeing it out. So that's the ADH. Okay, so ADH, so there is a disease that if our body has low ADH, if the person unfortunately has low ADH, then the urine has no way to pump back to our body. How much you drink, how much you pee. And then they will go into the bladder, and the person will pee a lot because it's not reserved, it's not retained in the body. And that's another form of, it's a form of diabetes. It's called the diabetes insipidus. So it means that it's not sweet urination, but it's a urination. So the person urinate a lot. And that is because of the decreased amount of ADH in the body. So you need to know that relationship. That's what's the cause of diabetes insipidus.
Low ADH.
Low ADH, thank you, low ADH. Because you will see this question and saying that is that low ADH, high ADH, or something like low insulin, for example, or high insulin, or like low something something, high something something. So none of this is low ADH. Okay, and this could be part of the posterior pituitary gland disease, because posterior pituitary glands, as we see her here, or the thalamus release this posterior pituitary gland, ADH and oxytocin. Low oxytocin, we will see that in most of the time, it doesn't really affect us that much, but low ADH is critical, okay? Because if the person has low ADH, the person will pee a lot. And the reason is that the water in the nephron is not controlled. Water basically, because this filtering has no control. Once the water goes through this one, fluid goes through, here has no gate, nothing control it. The way we control it, control how much urination we make, is down here, down this row. And so water taking back, so water goes through it and taking back. And this way is way that there is no control. So basically all the fluid goes through this tubule, but only pure water got retained. And that's the way we filter the toxic stuff into in our body. So everything you eat or you drink, even though all the drug you take, the medicine you take, they will stay in the plasma, in the fluid, and they will be filtered in this tubule. So here contain a lot of bad stuff that we don't want. And we selectively take something we need back, water. Water is important. Water, pure water, H2O. And so that if we don't take it back, then this will be pee out, and it will be pee out a lot. A person without ADH can pee about a couple liters a day, compared to about 0.5 liter a day in the normal person. So that's the ADH. And ADH release is triggered by two systems, two mechanisms. One is the renin-angiotensin system. Which one you remember?
The kidney.
Yes, thank you. So renin is released from the kidney. Angiotensin is can cause vasoconstriction. Angiotensin 2 can cause the release of ADH. So I don't know if I have the picture. Oh, right here, man. Lucky you. Lucky me. So we have this chart before, right? Do you guys remember?
Yeah.
Okay, so renin, angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2. One of the function angiotensin 2 is acts on the brain, hypothalamus, to release ADH. And the ADH acts on the kidney to retain water, to cause the water retention right here. Water retention. So that's one mechanism, ADH released by angiotensin 2. So renin-angiotensin 2 pathway. Another way to trigger ADH release is the Osmo receptor in the hypothalamus. So because this ADH is produced by the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus can detect our body's blood density. That if our blood is very dense, it indicates that we are so thirsty that we need water. We need water to replenish those lost fluid. A common reason for that high dense water in our blood is sweat. So for example, if the person is in the land, like we are in the land, and we didn't get to drink water, but our skin evaporate over time. So we have sweat, we have, even though you don't feel the sweat, we got evaporated fluid. So the water in our body will gradually decrease. And the way to see that decrease is the density of our blood become increased. And that leads to the high osmolarity of the blood. Not worry about this one, don't worry about this one. So this one. So here is our brain. So here, you see here. So this is our brain, hypothalamus. Hypothalamus can detect the here we have the Osmo Receptor. It detects the plasma osmolarity, and if it's too high, means the blood is too condensed. Then our brain will do two things. One is release ADH, acts on the kidney to retain water. So it means that we lost a lot of water, we need to retain it. And in that situation, the person will pee much less. The urine will become more yellow, and it will be a lot of stuff there. But we can reserve a lot of pure water in our body. So that's one thing, it will act on it, ADH. When our Osmo receptor in our brain detect the high density in the blood, it will cause psychologically to move this person to feel a sense of thirst. And that will drive the person to drink water, to search for fluid. So one way, we reserve the one we have in our body, so keep the fluid in the body, don't waste it. Another one is to find another water to drink it, so we can get more water into our body. So that's the consequence, that these two are parallel. Internally, ADH is increased to retain the water. Psychologically, we will be driven by something. We become like a zombie. We will to search for water because our brain tells us so. And so we will go to the grocery store. We are so thirsty. We go to the Starbucks. We go to somewhere else, and to try to find water. Do you buy pure water or do you buy juice, sweet drink?
Pure
Pure
water.
water.
Eat all the time.
All right. So that's the thing, when people feel thirst, and that is driven by our hypothalamus. When you feel thirst, we sometimes drink something cold, but not pure water. Somebody will drink alcohol, beer, somebody will drink juice,
Soda.
soda, right? And this is not pure water. So when this thing go into our body, it doesn't make our blood become dilute. It will make our body become even condensed. Our blood become even condensed. And that will be detected by our hypothalamus. Hypothalamus will say that, well, the blood is so condensed, I need to force this person to drink some water. So I will send a signal, say that you are thirsty, and the person drink not water, but juice, sweet stuff, soda, and that doesn't solve the problem, and the person will feel thirsty again, and this cycle continues. So just after this one, just keep in mind that when you feel thirst, you don't even need to buy water, but just drink water, because buying water, I feel, is wasting money. Just go to the fountain and drink water, but don't drink. A lot of people drink alcohol. They are thirsty, they drink alcohol. Alcohol has two consequences. One is that it doesn't really solve the thirst problem. Your blood remain high density. And the second one is that it reduces your mental judgment. So you don't feel like you lose the control on your behavior. So that's something to keep in mind. Any questions so far? Rex, are you still going to do the dehydration?
Yeah, I'm getting a lot of good material. Can I use
I
all
know,
this?
right? I feel like I kept talking something about
I was like, this is perfect. Thank you.
All right, so that's the ADH. And the oxytocin is another hormone released from the anterior pituitary gland. And the oxytocin has two effects. One is that it causes the constriction of the pregnant uterus. So that's during the baby delivery. And the other one is milk ejection. So that's the function of oxytocin. A lot of time we are not in these two conditions. Not like male, we don't really experience this, or even female, it's not like we have experienced this all the time. So if the person has low oxytocin, we don't usually feel anything. But if the posterior pituitary gland is injured, the low ADH will become very obvious that the person will pee a lot. But low oxytocin, usually, unless it's in a certain time of the life, you will feel that you will feel the needs of it, or you will feel the deficit, if there is deficit, the consequence of it. But other than that, we don't really feel it. However, another people have known this for a while, that is related to the psychological effects, that it makes the person feel bounded. So this one will apply to us all the time, even male, that even though we don't have this experience, but we do feel the sense of bonding, the family connection, and that is affected by the oxytocin. So oxytocin released into the brain and can provide the sense of the bondage, a satisfaction, relationship, something like that.
How would you increase that? How would you increase the production of that?
That's a good question. Usually the body touch affects it. So hug, for example, there is one research that people found is that, for example, I also teach in a physical therapy program, and they found that physical therapy, when we do the physical therapy, some study found that the oxytocin can increase. So maybe that maybe it's not exactly touch, but when you have that sensation to feel like cared, and you probably will trigger the person to, like, for example, mother feeding baby, that kind of condition, that kind of visual or physical touch can make the person to release part of this oxytocin. So yeah, so if you have a relationship, you want to increase this oxytocin to feel like bondage, love, care, talk to each other, spend time, even though we have social distancing, right? But send some message there, care. Yeah.
So I'm guessing like traumatic experiences would affect this production though, right?
I don't know. I hope somebody can do this as a physiology topic, but yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So that's the posterior. Then let's move on to the anterior. Anterior is unique in a way that so posterior easy. So you must, even though the hypothalamus pituitary glands, the only two things you must know is ADH and oxytocin are released from the posterior. And that is actually synthesized in the hypothalamus, move way all down to the posterior and release it. ADH related to the water retention, and the low ADH cause the diabetes insipidus. So that must know. Anterior is more complicated, so even though you don't remember, that will be okay. So here, anterior is that, here is the anterior pituitary gland. One thing about the anterior pituitary gland is that it's not synthesized in the hypothalamus, it's synthesized locally. We have about 7 to 9, depending on how critical it is, hormones released from the anterior pituitary gland, and they are produced here locally and released here locally. So it's not like posterior Adh, oxytocin, they produce in the hypothalamus, released in the pituitary gland. Anterior, they are produced, released locally. Here is the hormone of anterior pituitary gland. These are the major one. The reason that there are several other more, but something that's like a growth hormone. Growth hormone is high when the person develop, like from baby to like a young adult. This one is critical to make the body grow. ACTH, adrenal corticotropin, is also important. Basically this one and this one. The reason is that adrenal corticotropin, ACTH, affects adrenal cortex hormone, and we will talk about it later. This is in the adrenal cortex. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH actually, acts on the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland will release T3 and T4. So we will also talk about this one. So these two are important. Other than that, this one is important, but we are not going to really talk about it. This one and this one, we are not going to talk about it. But you know that from this anterior pituitary glands, they release growth hormone, ACTH, TSH, prolactin, gonadotropin hormone, gonadotropic hormone. And the release of this hormone from the anterior is controlled by the hypothalamus. So hypothalamus, even though that is just short distance from here to here, it's not like very far away, but the hypothalamus release hormone, this release hormone in the blood circulating down here to affect this anterior pituitary gland. So we have that one-on-one relationship from the hypothalamus. It produces the corticotropin releasing hormone, acts on the anterior to release the ACTH, corticotropin, adrenal cortical, ACTH, what's that? Adrenal corticotropin hormone. And then dopamine inhibit the release of prolactin from the anterior. PRH, prolactin releasing hormone, cause the release of prolactin. Growth hormone releasing hormone cause the pituitary gland to release the growth hormone. Gonadotropin releasing hormone cause it to release the luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Somatostatin inhibit the TSH, TRH, thyroid tropin releasing hormone, stimulate the release of TSH. So here just showing you the one-on-one relationship that hypothalamus release a list of hormone, and this list of hormone acts on the anterior pituitary gland to cause them to release another list of hormone. But it's like one-on-one relationship. Any questions on this one?
what should be our takeaway from here?
Takeaway
know.
from this is that first thing is that anterior pituitary hormone different from the posterior in the way that anterior pituitary hormone produce and release their hormone locally. In the posterior, the hormone only two, ADH and oxytocin, are produced in the hypothalamus, move down to the axon terminal, released in the anterior pituitary gland, in the posterior pituitary gland. So that's the difference. The second thing you need to know is that the release of the anterior pituitary hormone is controlled by the hypothalamus hormone, because in the posterior, it's not controlled by the hypothalamus hormone. Like ADH is controlled by the thirst. Oxytocin is controlled by kind of like emotional touch. But in the anterior, this hormone, this hormone, one-on-one is controlled by the hypothalamus hormone. So that's something you need to know. And in addition to that, like a broad, like a concept, detailed, even though you don't know now, we will learn it. We will go back to these two, ACTH and the TSH, because this one acts on the adrenal cortex, and we will talk about the adrenal cortex next week. This one acts on the thyroid gland. We will talk about the thyroid gland next week. So even though you don't memorize these two, but you have the idea that this one is produced in the anterior pituitary gland, and that they will. So basically here we have the hypothalamus release hormone on the anterior pituitary gland, and this hormone will act on another gland to release hormone. And for example, that the TSH, hypothalamus release TSH, sorry, TRH. Anything from the hypothalamus is something releasing. So you can see that from hypothalamus, something releasing, something releasing, something releasing. So for example, the hypothalamus T thyroid releasing hormone, anterior pituitary cause it to release TSH, and to the thyroid to release T3 and the T4. So it's like a one-on-one relationship from the brain to the lower brain to the peripheral endocrine system. So.
All right, sounds good.
And the next week we will start by talking about the thyroid and adrenal, and then maybe the next week we'll talk about the pancreas.
Yeah, we're just checking how much money I get.
Any questions?
So for the summary, Professor, do you want us to do at least what I did kind of last week, was split, you know, if it's 2 pages,
Yes.
kind of split it
Yes.
between the respiratory and lungs, and then the endocrine today?
Yes, yes. Because today we basically cover a complete segment, like hypothalamus and the pituitary. So you can summarize those portions. And in the hypothalamus pituitary, the major thing is these two, ADH and the oxytocin. And the major thing is actually ADH. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, then, and I will end it today. Stop recording. So last week we talked about this hypothalamus and the pituitary, and then today we are moving on from the top down to here, thyroid gland. So thyroid gland is the gland that's right next to right in our neck, and right next to the this vocal cord area, and it has this butterfly shape. So this gland produces thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone basically has two major types, T3 and T4. So we will learn about that. So in this gland has the major area is called follicle cells, follicles. So this is the follicle. Each follicle has one epithelium cell as the cell membrane, as the the membrane. So very much like our alveoli. It also has one epithelium cell, secrete. What's that? I forgot. Surfactant. So the alveoli epithelium cell secrete surfactant to reduce the surface tension. And here, this not alveoli, but very similar structure is called follicular cells. These cells secrete the thyroid hormone T3 and T4. So 3 and 4 indicate how many iodine binds into these chemicals. T3 is triiodothyronine, T3, and T4 is thyroxine. And so these two are hormones secreted produced from these follicular cells. And when they are produced, they will be stored in this follicle. So this is a fluid, this is like a little pocket to store this. And when are they going to be released? Only when they receive signal from our pituitary. Anterior pituitary will reproduce this hormone called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, that will stimulate this thyroid gland to release T3 and T4. Then it will be released into the blood. So that's a major one. And in addition to these follicular cells, we also have these parafollicular cells. These cells produce another group of hormone. It's called calcitonin. And the function of calcitonin is to regulate our body's calcium level. So if our body has high calcium level in the blood, if we have high calcium level, that will move this calcium into our bones to store this back into our body to reduce the concentration of calcium in the blood. So that's these two hormones. So look at this T3 and the T4, the production. So these two hormone, T3 and T4, are all produced from these follicular cells, and they are, when they are produced, they store in this follicle. Inside of this follicle, this fluid is called colloid. So it's right here, colloid. And so they basically is produced and stored in this colloid, and waiting for the signal to be released. So this is an example, like a cartoon. So here is the precursor of this thyroid hormone, each one coming from the tyrosine. This is a tyrosine. Each tyrosine are attached to this big string. This is called thyroglobulin. So this big string contains about hundreds tyrosine. So here it has hundreds of tyrosine. Each tyrosine has the potential to be decorated to become T3 or T4. So if this tyrosine receive ion, then if we have 3 ion, 4 ion, we can produce a T4. We can decorate each of these tyrosine to make it T4. If it has 3 ion, it will make this tyrosine to become a T3. So you can imagine that each of these thyroglobulin, each one is very much like a string, has several bits on it, and each bit is a tyrosine. So this is a precursor of T3 or T4. And when the person has eaten, received the iodine, this iodine will then be transported into the thyroid gland, and then this thyroid gland will take that iodine into the follicle, and follicular cells will then use it to decorate each of these tyrosine to produce T3 and T4. And once it's finished this production, it remains attached to this thyroglobulin. So it's not released until this gland receives the signal to release it. Any questions? So basically, maybe several things summarize several important key information. One is that the precursor of T3 and T4 is tyrosine, and the tyrosine attached to this string. This string is called thyroglobulin. Each of these thyroglobulin has about 100 of this tyrosine. One thing is that the precursor is tyrosine, and then the next thing is that to decorate, to convert this tyrosine to T3 and T4, our body need to take the diet contains iodine. So second thing is that iodine is needed. And the third thing is that thyroid hormone has 2 major forms, T3 and T4. So let's do a comparison of these 2 hormones. So even though our body produces 2 hormones, T3 and T4, we have more T4 than T3. So there are more T4 in our body than T3. T4 has longer lifetime. T4 is less active, less potent than T3. So T3 is very active. So when it's out there, it's gonna be used because they're gonna react with our cells to be used and to provide its function. T4, on the other hand, is less active. Our body produces more T4, and the T4 is more stable, so it will stay in our bloodstream for a longer time. And so when T3 is used, T4 then converts to T3, and then T3 will be used. So body, we produce a lot of T4, little bit T3, and the T4 is very stable. But when T3 is used, T4 can be converted to T3, and then body can use it. So this T4 in our body circulation, they serve as like a reservoir. Let me check this email very quick. Let me see. All right, good. So this T4 is like a reservoir. It contains this hormone that's when it's needed, it can be converted to T3. And T3 is the one that's do the job to be there to interact with the cells to boost our body's metabolic rate. So here is some comparison. Our body produces more T4 than T3. And both T3 and T4 can be produced from our glands. But in our body, T3 can also be, the source of T3 can also be coming from the T4. So about 20-25% from the glands, the remaining part coming from the T4. T3 is more active, so the half-life is shorter, about 1 day. T4, 7 days, a week. and T3 is more potent than T4. So this is quite important in the way that when you measure in patient, for example, when you measure the patient about the thyroid level, when we measure patient the thyroid level, do we measure T3 or T4?
I think the T3.
T4. You'd
T4.
probably T4 because T3's half-life is so
Thank you.
fast that the level wouldn't be.
Tiffany again, right?
That was Caitlin.
Helen, oh man, all right, good, thank you. Yeah, so it's T4. T4 is more stable. T3 is very short life. Besides, T4 has higher amount. So when we do the measurement, it's better to get an accurate. Like T3 is so tiny, so little, that we need to have very precise measure to get it. But T4 is larger amount. So we usually, knowing that, we know that in the clinical setting, we usually measure T4 to estimate our thyroid hormone level. And also you can have a question like T3 and T4, which one is more potent, that is T3. So something like that. So the production of the thyroid hormone is based on this pituitary gland. And so hypothalamus release TRH. I mixed it up earlier, sorry. Hypothalamus release TRH, thyroid release hormone, and the pituitary produce the TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. This TSH will stimulate this thyroid gland to produce T3 and T4. And when thyroid produce T3 and T4 in the blood, T4 will be converted to T3 because T3 has shorter lifetime. And then T3 is more potent to act on different organ system to promote this metabolic rate. When our body produce T3 and T4, they will also send a negative feedback into our hypothalamus and the pituitary to inhibit the production of TRH and TSH. So that way that if the pituitary somehow produce too much of the T3 and the T4 in the blood, that high amount will become an inhibition into our brain to prevent the production of TRH and TSH. So, and when TSH is lower, and that can reduce the stimulation to the thyroid gland, and then that can reduce the production of T3 and T4. So that way we can maintain the body to produce the T3 and T4 in a stable manner. Any questions? So that's how our body receives. Our thyroid gland is regulated to produce this T3 and T4. So TSH from the hypothalamus, sorry, TRH from the hypothalamus, TSH from the pituitary gland. Whether is that an anterior pituitary or is posterior pituitary?
Anterior.
Anterior, Simon. I know I can count on you. Yeah. So that's anterior pituitary.
1 point.
1 point. Here we go. So that's the so that's how our thyroid is regulated, basically from our brain. So the function of this thyroid hormone is the major function is to regulate our body's metabolic rate. And lower T3 and T4 will reduce this cellular metabolic rate, meaning that it will use less energy produce less ATP. So everything kind of like slowing down. So people will feel a little bit fatigued if the thyroid hormone is low. So this T3 and T4, because it promotes the thyroid, it promotes this metabolic rate, it can also increase our body's activity. And so our body will need to take more food. So it will increase the appetite, increase the food intake. It can also increase our circulation. Is because that our body produce more ATP, meaning that our body require more oxygen, meaning that we need to have enough blood circulate to supply this oxygen to the organ where it's needed. And it can also boost our mental excitement. So that's the function of T3 and T4. Any questions? All right. So given that, we all should have the idea that if the person has the lower T3 and T4 or higher T3 and T4, how are we going to diagnose it? Okay, so here is that in the clinical setting, patients may have hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism. So here is an hypo. Hypo means low. So if the patient has low T4, meaning that patient have a hypothyroidism, and then how can we diagnose it? If the patient has hyperthyroidism, then what's the symptom? What's the signs? And how can we confirm it? So here, let's talk about the hypo first. Hypothyroidism. And so basically, if the patient come to you, or when you see your relatives or friends is very tiring, afraid of the cold, meaning that maybe the metabolic rate is low, and maybe you have some symptom like, or maybe you can see the like a thyroid nodule, or has some symptom there, then you can probably will see the doctor, and doctor will do a blood test to see whether you have hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism. So hypothyroidism has two possible type. One is the primary hypothyroidism. Primary means, or secondary. Primary means that this lesion exists right at the thyroid. So primary hypothyroidism means that the thyroid is injured, is damaged. And we will talk about that two type of primary hypothyroidism that commonly, or we will see in the patient. So either one, we will see that damage in the, if it's primary, is the cause directly coming from this thyroid gland. And because of that, we will see low T4 and low T3, of course, because T4 is live longer, so we can detect T4. That level is low, it's reduced. And in addition to that, this low T4 will have less negative feedback to hypothalamus and the pituitary glands. And so consequently, low T4 has low negative feedback will cause an increased TSH because we have less inhibition into the pituitary glands. So we will see an increased amount of TSH. However, with high TSH, its job is supposed to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more T3 and T4, but because this machine is already defected, so even though we provide a stronger stimulation, it still cannot stimulate it to produce the amounts that body needed. So we will, in the primary hypothyroidism, we will see two signs, two major. One is low T4, and the other one is high TSH. And that will classify this patient as a hyperthyroidism, a primary hyperthyroidism. And another type is the secondary hyperthyroidism. The secondary is that the damage is not happens or is not directly caused by the thyroid gland, but caused by the hypothalamus or pituitary, so in the brain, and the damage in the brain. And so that will have a lower production of TSH. Lower TSH has lower stimulation. The thyroid gland will produce lower amount of T3 and T4. So with the secondary, this secondary is also called a central hypothyroidism. That's from the central portion, the brain, will lead to low T4 and the low TSH. So in both primary and the secondary hypothyroidism, we have low T at T4. But to distinguish whether it's primary or secondary, we look into the TSH. If the TSH is high, it indicates that it's primary, because the low T4 negative feedback will produce high TSH. But if it's secondary, it means that the central hypothyroidism, that the TSH is low in the beginning, and then we will have low TSH and the low T4. So that's how do we distinguish the difference, distinguish the diagnosis of the primary and the secondary hypothyroidism. Any questions? So the primary hypothyroidism coming from two causes. The major causes are these two. One is that the primary is the thyroid gland cannot produce its function. And the cause to make it not able to produce its function is because that perhaps the patient has low iodine in the diet. So it's called iodine deficiency. That patient has low iodine. So low iodine, our follicular cells cannot convert tyrosine to T3 or T4. And then we will have lower production of T3 and T4. So that's the iodine deficiency. This iodine deficiency as the cause of the primary hypothyroidism is more common in the worldwide, but relatively rare in the United States. In America, the major cause of the primary hypothyroidism is because of the autoimmune disease that our body recognize this thyroid for some patients. Our body recognizes these thyroid glands as an enemy. So they produce the antibody to recognize our follicular cells and start to attack it. And so it gradually destroy our thyroid glands, and then the patient will not be able to produce this T3 and T4. This autoimmune disease has a name. This name is called Hashimoto disease. So Hashimoto disease is a primary hypothyroidism, and Hashimoto disease is also an autoimmune disease. So we must know this term, Hashimoto disease, as a primary hypothyroidism. Any questions? So here we see that the symptom, a typical symptom of the hypothyroidism, the patient has a low metabolic rate. So because the rate is lower, it cannot produce a lot of ATP. When body has lower metabolic rate, the body cannot produce heat high enough. So our body cannot, patient will feel cold, afraid of cold, and maybe feel tiring, fatigue because of the low, and also the mental excitement will be reduced. So that's some symptom of the hypothyroidism. On the other hand, we have this another contrast of the thyroid disease, that is the hyperthyroidism. So this is that we have overproduction of T3 and the T4. So in this patient, we can do the blood test. T4 will be high, and also that high T4 will lead to a low TSH. The majority of this hyperthyroidism is the primary. We have not seen a lot of this secondary hyperthyroidism. So the majority is the primary. And so it is the cause that our thyroid glands is too active. And so it produces too much of the T3 and T4. And what makes it so active? The reason is that it's another type of autoimmune disease. It's called Graves' disease. So right here, Graves' disease. So Graves' disease also recognizes it produces this antibody, but this antibody, instead of attacking this thyroid gland, this antibody binds on the thyroid glands, and the thyroid glands see it as an TSH. So even though our brain produces normal level of TSH, but this antibody is recognized by the thyroid gland as an TSH. So it's floating there, binds on it, thyroid gland see it as a stimulation, so thyroid gland will produce more T3 and T4. And the more T3 and T4 tell the brain that we have too much T3 and T4, so brain will reduce the production of the TSH. But it doesn't really reduce the production of T3 and T4 from our thyroid gland, because this antibody is still coming over from the B cells to act on it, to stimulate our thyroid. So our thyroid will be working to produce this hormone. And in the end, we just have too much of this T3 and T4 in our body. And that causes the hyperthyroidism, primary hyperthyroidism. So here is some symptom that the patient has hyperthyroidism, will have higher metabolic rate, and so it produces a lot of heat, and very excited, but also very easy get tired because burn out of all this energy. Because of the heat, it cannot sleep well, and burn this fuel in the body, so it will lose weight. The excitement will make the heartbeats become faster, and because of the heat, the person will sweat a lot and the anxiety. So that's the hyperthyroidism. So here basically here, the cause of hyperthyroidism, the major one is the autoimmune disease called Graves' disease. This Graves' disease is that the autoimmune antibody serve like a TSH, and that binds on the thyroid hormone, binds on the thyroid cell, and to stimulate it to produce T3 and T4. And another common one is called multinodular goiter, and basically that we have overproduction of these follicular cells. Even though it's overproduction, the structure remain normal, so it's not a tumor cell. Usually tumor cell, you will not see a good follicular structure. The tissue structure will be very random, very distorted. But with this nodule, we see that it remains a good tissue structure, but it's overproduced. So it's not going to be like a metastasis, but it will stay there, and with this multinodular goiter, the patient will also have too much of these follicular cells to produce too much of the T3 and T4. Any questions? Let me check this email very quickly. Any questions? All right then. So let me see. Okay. So here, this figure showing you all these possible causes of the hyperthyroidism. So if we see the patient with hyperthyroidism, that too much of this T3 and T4 in the body, we need to measure its blood to see whether that is primary or secondary. Hyper usually is a primary, and so primary basically has two possible causes. One is Graves' disease, and the other one is multinodular. And so with the Graves' disease, we, in addition to measure the blood T4 to see whether T4 is high, we also measure the blood antibody to see whether we have this Graves' antibody in the body to see if it's there, and that can identify this patient is the Graves' disease. So it could be the autoimmune disease. And or in addition to that, we can do an ultrasound to detect our thyroid gland, because this is very much like close to our body surface. So we can measure, we can see it quite easily that whether this one has a multinodular goiter. So that's probably the major two causes. First cause is the Graves' disease antibody serve like a TSH, and that stimulate is growing. Another type is the multinodular goiter. So we can see that growing overproduction of these follicular cells by using the ultrasound to detect it. So that is good, like an easy way to identify. Another one could be the tumor. So thyroid tumor, the number that is actually growing over time. So this one become quite important. So if it's not all these three, then another possibility is that this patient may already take the pill. A lot of patients that has the thyroid glands removed or partially removed. And so the patient will rely on, it's not that like big deal because we can take the pill, we can take the T3 and T4, and so the body will still have the normal level of T3 and T4 in the body. But if the patients take the pills at wrong dosage, then the patient may also have the either too low or too high to cause the hyperthyroidism. So that's the 4 possible causes of the hyperthyroidism. Now let's look into another one, that is the goiter. So as we mentioned, that multinodular goiter is a sign of the hyperthyroidism. But before we jump into the conclusion, don't jump to the conclusion too quickly, because this goiter could be the hyperthyroidism, as we mentioned before, or it could be the sign of hypothyroidism. That is because that if the patient, for example, is common this thing in the like lower poor country, that it doesn't, the people doesn't have don't have the iodine in the diet, then this TSH will stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more T3 and T4, but low iodine, they just don't have the material to produce that. And that stimulation from the TSH will make the gland to become duplicated, to become a larger thyroid gland. And so that can also lead to a goiter in the thyroid gland. So the goiter could be two types. One is the hypothyroidism related goiter, or it could be the hyperthyroidism related goiter. So just look at the goiter. You will see that this patient has thyroid level abnormal. But to be sure, you need to do the blood test to see whether it has high T3, T4, or low T4 in the body. So next one is the parathyroidism. So in a quick summary of this thyroid gland in terms of the disease, you need to know that hypo and hyper, and more importantly, you must have this one print in your brain that Hashimoto is the hypothyroidism. Graves' disease is hyperthyroidism. So, yeah. Any questions? Because this one can be very tricky, that maybe you see the question like Hashimoto, then you have a list: hyperthyroidism, hypothyroidism, or hyperadrenalism, or hypoadrenalism, or hyper something, hypo something, and just by looking at the name, you don't know Hashimoto. Who's that? I mean, what's it? But you need to know that you need to have direct link that is the hypothyroidism, and the Graves is hyperthyroidism. Grave, like gravy, you know, you want more gravy with your turkey, something like that. So it's like a lot more hyperthyroidism. So that's the thyroid gland. The next one is the parathyroidism. So this one is another like 4 or 6 small glands embedded into our large. So it's not part of the thyroid gland. It's not the follicular or parafollicular cells. This one is parathyroid gland. They form its own organ, but embedded into our butterfly thyroid gland. And this parathyroid gland produces the parathyroid hormone. And the parathyroid hormone serves the function to adjust, to regulate our blood calcium level. So basically, that if our body has low calcium, if the blood has low calcium, so here is the blood serum or plasma has low calcium, this parathyroid gland will detect that low calcium and will try to increase the blood calcium level. Calcium is very important in body function, like heart pumping, heart muscle contraction require calcium, muscle contraction require calcium. So our body, besides especially that heart pumping, that calcium coming from the extracellular space. So basically coming from our plasma, our blood. And so that level is quite important to maintain our body's normal function. So if that level is low, then parathyroid release the parathyroid hormone to go to the bone to extract part of the calcium from the bone into the blood, go to the kidney. In the kidney, because the kidney that we kind of have sense that is a filtering system, fluid, if we don't control it, everything going to be pee out. And what's the hormone to prevent too much of the water urination?
ADH.
Good job, man. Is that Eddie? I assume that's Eddie. Sounds like Eddie to me.
It was this girl over here.
Oh boy.
Look at that.
That's
Yes, you look at me. Was it hot over there?
Yeah, a little bit.
All right, okay. Yeah. So the and so basically everything gonna be pee out. And if we don't control it, everything, I mean, good stuff, bad stuff. The idea is to let the bad stuff going out, but we want to keep the good stuff back to our body. For example, water is very important. Glucose is also important, so we will need to carry it back if it's too much. If it's any actually in the urine, we will have diabetes mellitus, another type of diabetes. So calcium is also important, but calcium can be regulated because depending on the diet, that we may have too much of calcium or too little of calcium. So so calcium level, if our body calcium level is low, don't eat vitamin. Don't eat the vitamin to boost it, because our body has a way to regulate. Maybe have some sun, sun exposure, because vitamin D is important to take our preserve this calcium. And so parathyroid hormone will act on the kidney in order to, if it's low, then it will act on the kidney to extract this calcium back to our body to prevent it urinated out. It can also make this kidney to produce more of the vitamin D. Vitamin D is important in our GI system, in our gastrointestinal system, to absorb calcium. So that way it can regain our calcium level. So that's a function of the parathyroid hormone. So here we learn, just today, just this hour, we learned two hormones. It's important to regulate our calcium level. One is the parathyroid hormone, that is the one to increase our blood calcium level. Another one is the earlier we talked about the calcitonin released from the follicular cells, and that's one that is going to reduce if our blood calcium level is too high, it will reduce it. So these two hormones basically serve as the hormone counteract to each other. One is, or complement to each other. That one is to help to increase the calcium level, and the other one is to reduce. To reduce it, basically just bring calcitonin, basically just bring this calcium from the blood into the bone, so it can reduce it. So that's the calcium. So next one is the adrenal glands. Any questions so far? So at this almost like an hour, less than an hour, we talk about these thyroid glands, and we talk about its function is to produce T3 and T4, and so you need to keep in mind that very basic. You need to know that T4 is more than T3. So when we detect in the blood, we detect T4. But you need to know that T3 is more potent, it's more active, and you need to know its function. And once you know its function, you will know that what's the symptom if the patient has low T3, T4, or if it's high. And so you know a symptom. And after you know the symptom, you need to know what is the cause. So those other things are very easy to memorize, but these two things is more difficult to memorize. One is Hashimoto disease, it's hypothyroidism. Graves' disease is hyper. The way I think about Graves' disease is I think about the gravy. You want some more to make your turkey taste juicy. So that's hyperthyroidism. So that's the, and also in addition that we also learn these two small hormones, calcitonin and parathyroidism, parathyroid hormone. Any questions? Which is the adrenal glands. So adrenal glands, we have two adrenal glands. Each one is located on top of the kidney. So here is the kidney, and this is the glands located on top of the kidney. And so each one has little like the pyramid, not exactly pyramid, but like the head located on top of this kidney. And this adrenal gland has two portions. It's if we cut it through, we can see something inside. So this one is very much like yeah. So it has the portion inside and the portion outside. So here we can see that the portion outside is called cortex, is right here, cortex, and the portion inside is called the medulla. So that's the adrenal gland. So we have the adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla. These two are very different. Adrenal medulla is part of our sympathetic nervous system. So if we are exciting, we are in the fighting or fight or flight mode, sympathetic will stimulate this medulla to produce epinephrine. It's also called adrenaline, and that is part of that excitement system. Adrenal cortex is different. Adrenal cortex produces a totally different group of hormone. These hormones are also called steroid hormone, so it's very different. Our body only has two organ, about these two organ region produce steroid hormone. One is the adrenal cortex, another one is the gonadal region like testes and ovaries produce the steroid hormone. Otherwise, the other hormones are non-steroids, meaning that they cannot go into the cell. They cannot penetrate through the cell membrane. Only this adrenal cortical hormone produce the steroid hormone can penetrate the cell membrane. So in here, we will focus on the adrenal cortex. The reason is that adrenal medulla is part of the sympathetic, and we kind of talk about it already. It's very straightforward that it produces the epinephrine, and that increase the heart rate, increase the blood pressure, and so provide more blood, and so we can ready to fight or flight. But adrenal cortex very different. So let's look at the adrenal cortex here. This is adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex has so the hormone produced from the adrenal cortex is called cortical steroids. That's because that these are all steroid hormone. There are three types of the cortical steroids. Basically, this region has 3 layers. One is called zona glomerulosa, very outer layer, zona fasciculata, zona reticularis. These 3 layers, each layer produce specific hormone. The outer layer produce mineral corticoids. So it's about mineral, meaning that it's about salt. The second layer produce glucocorticoid, and this one is about glucose. And the zona reticularis produce the hormone called androgen. So this one is about sex hormone. So that's these 3 layers, and these 3 hormones, mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens, are all steroid hormone. And because they are produced from the adrenal cortex, these are all collectively called cortical steroids. So that's the cortical steroid, is the lumped term for this different hormone. They are similar in the way that they are all steroid hormone. They are all made from the cholesterol, and the cholesterol makes some degradation, and it becomes the mineralocorticoids. The major mineralocorticoids is aldosterone. We will talk about that. The major glucocorticoid is cortisol. We will also talk about that. The major androgen is DHEA. We will also talk about that. So that's just like a big family. They are all called cortical steroids. They are all steroid hormone. So these are produced from the adrenal cortex. In the adrenal medulla, they produce the major one is epinephrine. And so that's very different. These 2 are very different. Their chemical structure are very different. Their function are also very different. Even though they just, located in the same adrenal glands, but adrenal medulla and adrenal cortex are produce very different group of hormone. Any questions? All right. So this one kind of summarize that we just mentioned that in the adrenal cortex, they are 3 layers. Zona glomerulosa is the outer layer, produce the mineral-related mineralocorticoids. Zona fasciculata in the second one. This portion is the major one though. This middle portion is about 75%. This one produce glucocorticoids, and if you want, you can write it right here, because we already learned this. So you can write it down here. That's this one is the join. Let me see that here, join. So this one, this mineralocorticoids, the major hormone is aldosterone. And here the glucocorticoids, this is the major one, so 75%. So when people talk about the cortical steroids, if they didn't really specifically say anyone, they usually refer to the gluco, because that is the major one. 75% are from the glucocorticoids. And the major of these glucocorticoids is cortisol. So cortisol is the major glucocorticoid hormone. So you can write cortisol here. And then the zona reticularis produce the androgen. this only has about 10%. Besides, this androgen is not that critical. This androgen is not like functionally ready. They usually just produce it as a precursor. It will be converted. So male, female will be different, right? And so this one produces DHEA. And then DHEA can be further derived into testosterone for male and estrogen for female. So this one is only produced as a precursor. It's not like a physiological function. So the major one is this one, cortisol. If people talk about the glucose, if people talk about the cortical means cortex. And to memorize it is that several things you need to memorize it. First is that we have 3. The other one is their location: glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis. From outside, GFR. From outside to inside, 3 layer. You don't need to memorize the whole world. If you can, that's good. But if you don't, it's okay, because in your exam, it will be most likely to be multiple choice. And so the only thing you need to know is to match that aldosterone is mineralocorticoids. They are produced from zona glomerulosa. So you need to memorize it, GFR. You at least you need to memorize that, these 3 letters, GFR, from outside to inside. And then from outside to inside is about mineral, is about salt, glucocorticoids, about glucose, and androgen, DHEA, is a precursor of sex hormone. So that's key, that you need to kind of like be able to match one to the other. Any questions? All right. So this one just showing you that they are all very structurally related. So here, cortical steroids. Here I show you that the typical hormone from the mineral, from this is mineral corticoids, aldosterone, glucose, cortisol. So this mineral, glucocorticoid, and the DHEA is the androgen. You can see that they are all structurally very related. They are all coming from the cholesterol. So in our body, we have some region require. It's not cholesterol is all that bad. It's too much, it's bad. But our body does need it to form this hormone. So these are all called steroid hormone. And in the very first day, we kind of already talk about that steroid hormone, because here is cell membrane. When we talk about the cell membrane is lipid, only 3 things can penetrate through membrane. One is that cortical steroids. Do you guys remember what's the other 3?
Water.
Good job. Who is that?
It's Tiffany. I've seen your age.
It's you.
And then small uncharged particles.
Yeah. So typical one is water, uncharged particle, and what's more like clinical relevant would be gas.
Gas. And wasn't it vitamin A?
Yes.
And
ADKE.
D.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the next one is the steroid hormone. All right, so that is that. And so let's look at, we basically will look at these 3 different group of hormone in their production and their function. Their production coming from different layer and their function. So their regulation first. Their regulation is regulated from the pituitary gland. So as we mentioned that in the anterior pituitary gland, two hormone is relevant to this course. They are the TSH, and that's for the thyroid glands. And here is the ACTH. ACTH coming from the anterior pituitary gland. And that is a hormone to stimulate the adrenal cortex to produce cortical steroids hormone. So that's the regulation. That our hypothalamus is very much like in the thyroid gland. Hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid gland. And here, hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal cortex. So that's the major regulation pathway. This one is also called the axis. So this term is, you probably hear this before, but if you don't, this is an important term. People mention about this all the time. That's hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal cortex, axis. So something axis. That refers to this one, like one following the other, this order, this command, like a command chain from the top to the middle to the lower, and the lower can send a negative feedback to the top. So that's the HPA axis. Is the beginning from the central hypothalamus, CRH to the anterior pituitary glands, ACTH to the adrenal cortex to produce cortical steroids hormone. And that can send a negative feedback. A common, the major one is the cortisol. Because even though this hormone has three different groups, mineral, glucose, DHEA is the glucose is the major one. This one has 75%. And in this glucose, the major one is the cortisol. So cortisol will send back signal to the brain. Any questions? And how is this regulated? So let's look at this one here. So this one is that the major regulation is by our body stress. So this stress is related to the another stress coming from the sympathetic. So these two are our body's reaction to the stress. Sympathetic, like fight and flight. This one is more acute stress, acute, like pressure stress. This stress is more chronic. This chronic stress could be, it's not very strong, but it's for long term. And that will stimulate our brain to produce the CRH, pituitary gland to produce ACTH, acts on the adrenal cortex. The major production is the cortisol. So that is the stress. Let me see who is, let me check here. Okay. Oh, all right. I will keep that in mind. All right. So that's the mechanism that how our body regulate the adrenal cortical hormone. Adrenal cortical hormone is also called cortical steroids. And that basically is from the brain to the pituitary, and our body produces this in a way to respond to the outside stress. This stress is a chronic stress. This stress is not just psychologically or mentally just acute response. This is more like long-term. It's more like endurance. Our body produces cortisol in a way to maintain our body produce cortisol in a way to prepare our body to endure a chronic stress, a chronic difficult time in order to continue living. So this difficult time can be mentally, psychologically stressed. It can also be physically, like if the person is under a physical struggling or physical pain, the body will stimulate this pathway to produce the cortisol. Any question? So have that in mind. Let's see what's the function of the how can our body respond to that stress? How can cortisol help to help our body to endure that difficult time? So that is the cortisol. So major thing is the cortisol. Cortisol. So cortisol has this function. It's glucose. It's part of the member of the glucocorticoids. So it regulates our body's glucose level. It is to increase our body's glucose level. So it will prepare our body to endure a difficult time by mobilize this glucose in the blood. So our cells can easily use them as a fuel. So it will glucogenolysis to convert this glycogen into the glucose. It can also suppress our immune system. Our immune system in a way it takes energy. You know, our T cell, B cell to attack these foreign particles, they take energy. And so when our body need to survive, what's more important is that, okay, just forget about that enemy. Just focus on what's more major that cells can survive. So it will cause the immune suppression and anti-inflammation. So we will keep our resources to maintain our body's function. So it can anti-inflammation, pain relief. So you will not feel that much pain, even though you have physical damage. With the cortisol, you won't feel that much of the pain. So you can focus on the situation and the work on. Steroid hormone can diminish the production of the prostaglandin. So we earlier learned about this prostaglandin is one of the major inflammatory cytokine to trigger a lot of inflammatory responses, and cortisol can suppress that. It can also stabilizing our lysosomal membrane and to inhibit the bone formation. So this basically is another mechanism that we won't use. We will preserve our resources to work on something more important. So that's the function of the cortisol. All right, so last time we will continue our endocrine system, and here is the so we basically talk about this adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex has 3 layers, so you need to know there are 3 layers. Zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, zona reticularis. So GFR. So these 3 layers are GFR right here. So it's a GFR, and each one produce specific hormone. So here is mineral, it's about salt, glucose, and this one is androgen. So those are the three hormone, three group of hormone to be produced. Mineralocorticoids, the major hormone is aldosterone. Glucocorticoids, the major hormone is cortisol. Androgen, the major hormone is, did he say if the final was multiple choice? Yes, yes. I did not say, but yes. All right, so 25 questions, multiple choice. And so the reticularis produce this hormone androgen, but overall that the major hormone is this cortisol, because 75% of that cortical steroids is cortisol. And what control these cortical steroids is the this HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal cortex. So that's the how our body regulates the production of corticosteroids. And what can so if this body mechanism is isolated from the outside world, this is the mechanism that keep it producing the same amount of the corticosteroids in the body. But our body need to respond to the outside world, that if there is any change, our body need to make the adjustment to respond to that. And what change affects this production? The change is the stress. So our body senses the stress. Stress is an emotional thing. Stress is a thing that's about our feeling. And that stress is, that feeling is sensed in the brain. So in our brain, the major part to sense that stress is the hypothalamus. So when hypothalamus sense that kind of stress, a chronic stress, for acute stress, it's gonna be a sympathetic effect. But if it's a chronic stress, then hypothalamus will produce the CRH, pituitary glands will produce ACTH, and that will trigger the release of cortisol or corticosteroids. But the major one is the glucocorticoid, and that is cortisol. And to respond to that, the cortisol will try to put the energy our body need to endure that kind of difficult condition. So one thing is that our body, all cells need glucose. And so glucose, that's why the name is glucocorticoids. That's because that it regulates the glucose distribution. So it will mobilize the glucose from glycogen, that is large particle, large molecule, to become monomer, the glucose, circulate in the blood. So that will increase glucose level in the blood. So that's one very, very important thing, that the cortisol will increase blood glucose level. So that's one thing. And then the second important thing is the immune suppression. And the following that is pain relief. So your immune system will be suppressed, that you don't fight those virus, bacteria. For people who get the organ transplantation, they will also take artificial cortisol in order to suppress their immune response, because our body will see that transplant organ as a foreign object and will fight it. And so cortisol has that function, immune suppression, pain relief. With this one though, increased blood glucose level what's the next thing you can think about the increase of blood glucose level? What's the next thing? How is this related to a disease? Blood glucose level.
Diabetes.
Diabetes, that's right. That's right. So increased in our blood, when the glucose level increase. This glucose level increase can be due to several things. A common thing that people think about is eating too much of the glucose, eating too much of the energy basically, or fuel that can be converted into glucose. And that usually be considered as the major culprit of the patient who has diabetes. But another cause that people usually didn't pay attention is the stress. Because stress can trigger the release of the glucose, and that will keep our blood glucose level always high. High blood glucose level, next thing is to trigger the release of insulin. It's like when we eat, our blood glucose level increase, and that triggers the release of insulin. The function of the insulin is to pump this blood glucose into the cells, so we can store it as extra fuel whenever when later we need it. And with high blood glucose level due to the stress, due to the cortisol, our body will generate insulin resistance because their insulin increase all the time and our cells become insensitive to the insulin. And that is a step toward the diabetes mellitus. And so this is for people developed diabetes, stress is one of the cause. Any questions? All right. Another very, very important thing about the glucose, cortisol, is that the level in our blood of this cortisol vary a lot throughout the day. So you can see that this is early morning sunlight. We can see that our blood glucose glucocorticoids, the major one is the cortisol. Cortisol level jump from 5 to 20 microgram per decimoliter. Doesn't matter the units or the number, but you need to know that the level increase in the early morning. And that basically in the way that it makes sense, because in the early morning we wake up, we are ready to go out to either hunt, to either gather the food, either to face all the challenges, all the difficulties, the real life. And so our body need to prepare us to face that. So cortisol will be increased. It will, even though we don't eat anything yet, breakfast, we have not eat, break that fast yet, we have not eat anything yet, cortisol will provide the glucose needed for our body to work, to function. And the immune suppression, pain relief. So just, get our body ready for the day. And then it gradually drops throughout the day. And during the nighttime, it will be very low. And then it starts over again in the next day. So that is very important concept, especially that if you work in hospital, that in the future, if you work, or you are not working in the hospital, that you take the blood to test the cortisol level. If you are doing it, you need to know what time, what time of the day, which hour this patient takes that blood test, because that level could be jump high to low very, very largely throughout the day. The number will be very different. This pattern that change over during one day, it is called rhythm. This rhythm is called circadian rhythm. Circa means surrounding or in the circumstance. Dian means day. So this is not like month. This is not like year. This is one day. So daytime to nighttime, that one day, that level change is called a circadian rhythm. Any questions? So a typical question for that circadian rhythm question would be cortisol level, which time period we see the highest cortisol level, and that's the early morning. So like 8 o'clock in the morning. Any questions? All right. So talking about the circadian rhythm and the hormone level vary due to the circadian rhythm. The very famous two are these two. One is the cortisol, the other one is melatonin. So these two appear opposite to each other. Melatonin is highest during the nighttime, the sleep time. Cortisol is highest during the early morning. So these two are the very famous one that melatonin released from the pineal glands is very lower part and in the center of the brain, and that release melatonin, it's very important to facilitate sleep, and it's high during the nighttime, and low during the daytime. So these two, melatonin and the cortisol, are the two very famous hormones that blood level vary very much during throughout a day. So that's that. Then that's glucocorticoids. The next one is the mineralocorticoids. The mineralocorticoids, the major mineralocorticoids is the aldosterone. The function of the aldosterone is to regulate our body. So this is mineral. So it's about mineral. Basically, it's about salt. Two salt that the aldosterone regulates: sodium and potassium. They regulate it in the kidney. And what they do is that they will cause the aldosterone absorption of sodium and secretion of potassium. So that's a function of aldosterone. It will help us, if the aldosterone acts on the kidney, it will cause our body to take this sodium back to our body and to release potassium into the urine, secrete it into the urine. So with the aldosterone, you will see it to be pee out, the potassium to be pee out, but sodium will go back to our body. So this is a kidney, this is nephron. Aldosterone acts on this nephron tubule. Next week we will talk about this tubule, and basically it acts on this final portion of the tubule called collecting tubule, collecting ducts. The collecting means collecting urination, and in this portion, whatever remaining will be pee out in the urine in this tubule. And the aldosterone serves as the final like a regulator And if our body needs sodium, it will reabsorb sodium. And in the same time, it will pump out the potassium into the urine. So the key here is that you need to know the function of aldosterone that basically doing two things. One is absorb sodium, and the other one is secrete potassium. This is very important because the question will be aldosterone, what's the function? Absorb sodium, absorb potassium, absorb sodium, secrete potassium, secrete sodium, absorb potassium. You know, there could be like random, like a combination of all these, but the answer is this: absorb sodium and secrete potassium. All right, then androgen, the major androgen is DHEA, but as I mentioned earlier, this DHEA is not a functional, it's not an active form of the hormone. So our body produces it. Male, female, doesn't matter, they produce this DHEA from the adrenal cortex. And then this DHEA will serve as a precursor. In the male, it will produce the testosterone. In the female, it produces the estrogen. So it will be converted to estrogen if it's female. So this one summarized the adrenal cortex, adrenal glands, cortex, and the medulla. In the cortex, we have 3 layers. Each layer produces specific hormone. And this is the major hormone from each layer: aldosterone, mineralocorticoids, cortisol, glucocorticoids, DHEA from the is the major androgen. And here is the medulla. Medulla produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. This is part of the sympathetic. And these three layers are the cortex. So this one is the cortex. And this one is the medulla. And the cortex, this cortex are steroid hormone. Steroid hormone. It's very different from the medulla. Any questions?
Yeah, just thinking aloud. Is there any relationship between aldosterone and the action potentials in the body? I know the other one has to deal pretty much with the electrical system in the heart and muscle. Is there any relationship between the absorption of sodium and the excretion of potassium, like we're discussing right now? Is there any relationship with action potential?
Very smart. Did you guys see his questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how does it affect? So let me. He put two things, like two different concepts together, but turn out they have relationship. So here we have aldosterone. We have the aldosterone. Sorry, let me put this one here. We have the aldosterone, and that cause our body to gain sodium and lose potassium. So that's one thing. That's our body, right? And another question is about action potential. And how does it related or affects one another? They affect. That's a very good question, because action potential is about membrane potential, right? So this is a cell, and a very relevant one is the action potential in our skeletal muscle, because basically that if we lost that action potential, we cannot move our muscle, and that is very direct effects say if our intestine doesn't really work, we don't really feel it right away. Our heart will affect a lot, but our other part of body, we don't really feel that much. Like if we lost the action potential or we reduce it in the brain, we may feel something, but we can think about that. We just feel tired or something like that. But if the muscle, we cannot act. It's direct. It's very relevant. It's very obvious. So how is these two related? You need to remember that our body, say very basic, like membrane, the cell, do we have more potassium inside or more sodium inside of the cell?
Potassium.
Potassium. Was that Tiffany again?
Yeah.
Good job. So we have more potassium inside of the cell, and that generates the resting membrane potential. And an action potential has the depolarization phase and the repolarization phase. In order to trigger an action potential, we need to bring the membrane potential to become positive, right?
Yeah.
So that is the basic. Now with the aldosterone. One thing, it gains sodium, it loses potassium. Let's say it loses potassium. So our body, potassium, we opens up a drain. So say this is a drain, drainage, D-R-A-I-N, drainage, A-G-E. So in this drainage, somehow our potassium pee out. So when our potassium pee out, this potassium inside of a cell will follow it to go down. When our body potassium level reduce, will it make the membrane potential to become positive or to become more negative?
Yes, more negative because we are losing.
That's right, Simone, thank you so much. So here, it will make our membrane potential, so here is originally resting membrane potential and it's waiting for the excitation, but with the losing of the potassium, the membrane potential will become negative. And then it becomes harder for us to excite it because we need to bring it above the threshold in order to trigger an action potential. But now with the aldosterone, the membrane potential become hyperpolarized, and that affects our ability to develop action potential. And that make our body, our muscle become more difficult to be excited. And that's how the aldosterone basically will cause the hyperpolarization and make it difficult to generate an action potential.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Thank you for the questions. Any other questions? All right, good. Let's move on to the next one. That is, oh, not yet. So with this in mind, that's adrenal cortex, let's talk about something clinical relevant. That is because when we talk about thyroid, we talk about hyper. When we talk about the ADH in the posterior pituitary gland, we talk about the lower ADH cause diabetes insipidus. Now in the adrenal cortex, let's talk about that, the major one, cortisol. And then the cortisol, one major disease about the cortisol is the Cushing syndrome. This is high, excessive cortisol level, so too much. And then this too much could be caused by several things. The common cause is that the exogenous causes, means that the person take the cortisol as a drug to suppress immune response. And that could be for patients who receive the organ donation, transplantation, and the person needs to take cortisol in order to prevent the rejection from the body. Or the patient may have the autoimmune disease. We mentioned about several autoimmune disease like Hashimoto, Graves. Those are autoimmune disease. To suppress that autoimmune response, the patient may also take the cortisol as a way to suppress it. And too much of the cortisol will cause Cushing's syndrome. And in addition to the exogenous Cushing's syndrome, it could be the pituitary tumor. So sometimes that the patients start to gain weight for no reason, work hard, try to exercise, and has the label that doesn't work too hard, but still gain weight. It could be the Cushing's syndrome, and that could be pituitary tumor or tumor in the adrenal cortex, and that causes the production of the cortisol. So the symptom of that Cushing's syndrome is gain weight, because basically that will mobilize the glucose in the blood. So even you don't eat, your blood glucose level is high, and then that high glucose level will will trigger the release of the insulin, and then insulin will transport it into the adipocyte. As we mentioned before, that did we talk about it? Glucose transporter? Maybe not. Okay, maybe later we will talk about it. But the insulin detect that high blood glucose level, they will shuttle them into the adipocytes, because the body will think that we have eaten a lot, even though actually the patient doesn't actually eat anything yet. But the body will think that, okay, he just have a good diet, big meal, and they will store that into the fat, into the fat cells, to store them as a fuel. So it will gain weight because those glucose will be stored as the triglycerides in the adipocytes. And this patient will also have a higher chance to develop type 2 diabetes. As we mentioned before, that cortisol increase the blood glucose level, and that will cause the body become insulin resistant, and that is a progress that for a long time the body will develop the type 2 diabetes. And this one is just like a simplified version of the symptom of Cushing's syndrome. Increased blood glucose level, high chance to develop the diabetes, anti-inflammatory, pain relief, so the patient will have less chance to feel pain. And on the other hand, the patient will get injured more easily. Even if there is any injury, the patient may not notice it. Immune suppression, the bone formation inhibition, cortisol will suppress the bone formation in order to focus on the body ideally to prepare our body to endure a difficult situation. But with this syndrome, the bone will become weakened. Increased insulin secretion because of the blood glucose level, and that will shuttle the glucose into the adipocytes. So we have fat storage. The body will will gain weight, moon phase in particular region of the body. We will see that buffalo hump, obesity, and skin will have some stretch. It could be that the damage, or pain relief, immune suppression. It could also be that cortisol can also mobilize proteins to become glucose. Basically, cortisol will mobilize everything, protein, glycogen, lipids to become glucose, so body can use. but that loss of the protein can also make the skin become not so smooth, thin skin, bruised, and drying. So that's the consequence. All right, so that the next one is the pancreas. I think this is the last one, right? Okay, I think that's the last one. Okay, so pancreas, pancreas. Here is the pancreas. By the way, did you guys learn the anatomy here in the Valley College?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Did
had
you
a
guys
horrible
do-
anatomy teacher.
Say again?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So did you guys do this dissection about the location of the pancreas, looking at the location of the stomach, liver?
Yeah.
Okay.
You mean on the
Okay.
models, Professor, or
On the cat.
On the cat. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So you know that's the pancreas location and what pancreas connects to. Don't worry.
Isn't it underneath your liver?
Underneath, but that's the location. So
Oh.
pancreas, they have to connect to somebody, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They are not like
To your intestine?
intestine. Thank you so much. Is that Tiffany again?
No.
Oh no, who's that?
Me, Lulu.
Lulu. All right, good job, good job. Your anatomy teacher will be happy that you remember this. So pancreas.
My point, and I'll be happy.
Okay. So pancreas connect to the intestine. In the human, it's called jejunum, and that shows the importance of the pancreas as a digestive tract, because pancreas release this hormone, or it's not just a hormone, but the enzyme for our body to digest the food. They release it and import those into the small intestine. And so small intestine, we have the food. And then over there, they will break down the protein into the amino acid, break down this carbohydrates to become monomer, monomer, yeah. So that is the pancreas digestive system, but pancreas also is an endocrine system. So pancreas has two types of glands. One is part of the digestive system. This is called the ascending. So here is the ascending. Ascending is part of the digestive system. They release the enzyme. Pancreas release a lot of digestive enzyme, very rich, very complex in a way that it releases several enzymes. This enzyme is designed in a way that is inactive when they are first produced, and when they reach the kidney, when they reach the intestine, the location, the environment, this acidic environment in the intestine, because our food go into the stomach, become very highly acidic, and that acidic level will convert this enzyme to become active. Otherwise, these enzymes are here, they will start to chewing all our organs already, but they didn't because they are inactive. So that's a way. And when they release into the intestine, they become active due to the acidic level in the environment. And so that's one digestive system. And the other is the endocrine system. So here is basically you see that this like so this one basically represent like a tube. So this is the inner portion, And then this one basically will flow into the small intestine. So they release this enzyme here, and they will flow into the small intestine. As the endocrine system, they don't have the duct. They don't release anything into the duct. They are released, just really release it, and this will pick up by the capillary and flow in the blood. So this part is the endocrine portion. This part has name. This name is called the Eyelet of Langerhans. So that's very important. Two important terms you need to know. Asthenia is this one. They secrete enzyme and release into the small intestine. Islets of Langerhans is another group of cells. These are the endocrine system. This islet of Langerhans has three types of cells. You can see it here: delta cells, alpha cells, beta cells. So you see, like here we have three different colors. There are three different cells. So in this islet of Langerhans, alpha cell about 25%. The hormone is glucagon. Beta cell, we talk about it since the beginning of our class. We always focus about this diabetes. Beta cells produce insulin. The major one is the insulin. It also produces amylin in about 100 to 10 level, 100 to 1 level. So the majority is insulin, but amylin is also important. Delta cells takes about 10% of the total. It produces somatostatin. So here is like adrenal cortex. We have 3 layers here. This is islet of Langerhans, has 3 types of cells: alpha cell, beta cells, delta cells. And each one produces different hormone. Glucagon from the alpha, beta cell insulin, delta cell somatostatin. And let's look at how it's produced. So let's say the beta cell first. So beta cell produces insulin. It's very important to regulate our body's glucose level. And how does it do it? So here is the beta cell. Here is the beta cell. Here in the beta cell, glucose cannot penetrate into the cell, but glucose can penetrate through the cells through a channel. So here we have the channel called glucose transporter 2, GLUT2. With this glucose transporter, if our body has the high glucose level, like our blood, our whole body, plasma has high glucose level. For example, if we just finish a big meal, our glucose level will be increased all of a sudden. Just right after you have the meal, your blood glucose level will increase. And that increase of the glucose level will diffuse into the beta cell. And you don't need to worry about this pathway, but you need to know that whatever it happens, it will cause the release of the insulin. So here, insulin was already made in the beta cell, stored in the vesicles. And when its glucose enter, actually the cell will trigger a depolarization, an action potential. Action potential will trigger the calcium, as we see this all the time. That calcium will undock these vesicles, making these vesicles to become exocytosis and to release the insulin. So that's how our beta cell releases insulin. So in a way that our body regulates the glucose level to maintain the homeostasis, is that we need to have the sensor and the integrator and the response. And the consequence is that we can bring the glucose level back to normal. The sensor is the beta cell. The response is the beta cell. Because the glucose level increase or decrease is not sensed by any other like sensory system. It basically is detected by the beta cell itself. So that is the beta cell detect the glucose level in response to high glucose level in the blood. What's that sound? Never mind. All right, never mind. All right, so when we have a meal, our body will release the insulin. So here is the time after the meal in about 5 minutes after the meal. 5 minutes after the meal, our insulin level will increase. Here is the plasma insulin level. This one is those insulin already made, stored in the vesicles. And with this one, glucose enter will force this insulin to be released. But this insulin has limited amount. So very quickly that we use all the insulin level decrease, but our blood still have high glucose. So in about 15 minutes later, our beta cell will start to produce more insulin, and then the insulin will be released again. So here, the two phases. In the first phase are the insulin produced from the insulin already made in the beta cell, stored in the vesicles. In the second phase, the insulins are released from the beta cells. Then what's the function of the insulin is to transport this glucose into the muscle and the adipocytes. So let's see, what do we have here? All right, we should be able to finish it. So basically the function of so here we have the insulin released. Now we are asking that what's the function? The function is, say we have this insulin. The function is to move this glucose into the muscle and into the adipocytes. When it's entered into the muscle, the glucose will form glycogen. Glucose will form glycogen. Sorry, glycogen. In the adipocytes, glucose will form triglyceride. So stored in the fat cells. One thing though, this glucose, so this one is the muscle cell. This one is the adipocyte. Glucose enter into the muscle cell through a channel. This channel is called glucose transport 4, GLUT4. So this one, GLUT4. Same thing like in the adipocyte. This is also a GLUT4. And because glucose cannot really diffuse into the cell, it has to be transported. And this transport has a term called GLUT4. This GLUT4 is important in the way that this GLUT4 is insulin dependent. Let's look at this figure here. This figure will show it. So basically that this is the cell membrane. This cell membrane can be either the muscle cell or it could be the adipocytes. And in the cell membrane, we have the channel called GLUT4. Glucose can diffuse into the cell through this GLUT4. But this GLT4 is insulin dependent. What it means is that they usually is not appear in the cell membrane. They are back inside cell. Here is the cytoplasm. And inside of cell, they are anchored on the vesicles. This is vesicle. V-E-S-I-C-L-E-S, on the vesicles. And so it's not on the cell membrane. It's stored, it's like hiding inside of cells. Only when the cell receives the insulin, this insulin will cause this push these vesicles to the cell membrane, to the cell membrane. And then they will be appeared on the cell membrane, open up as the door to let glucose go in. And so that's why this transportation require insulin. Without insulin, all this glucose, GLT4, will be retracted back to the cell, and they will not transport any glucose in because they are stored in the cell. Only when the insulin binds on it, GLT4 will be merged into the cell membrane and provide the channel needed for glucose to go in. Any questions? I just want to give you a quick summary about these two channels, GLUT4, as we mentioned here, and another glucose channel is right here, beta cell. Beta cell, we have the GLUT2. So in the beta cell, this GLUT2 is not insulin dependent because it's here all the time. But for the muscle cell, and the adipocytes, we have the GLUT4, and that is insulin dependent. So here we have at least two groups of cells, muscle cell, adipocyte. They have the GLUT4, and that is insulin dependent. Other cells, like the beta cell, it contains the GLUT2, and this is insulin independent. The GLUT2 is on the cell membrane all the time. GLUT4 is hiding in the cell. They are not out there. Only when muscle adipocytes detect there is an insulin, then they will move this GLUT4 in the cell membrane to transport the glucose into the cell. Any questions? All right. So key here is that two types of cells are insulin dependent, muscle cells, adipocytes. And because they have this glucose transporter, GLUT4, that is insulin dependent. A common question will be like, which glucose transporter is insulin dependent? GLUT1, GLUT2, GLUT3, GLUT4? Which one?
2.
4 is insulin dependent. Because that is the one located in the muscle cell, and in the adipocyte. GLUT2 is in the beta cell. They don't care about insulin. They are there all the time. But in the muscle and the adipocytes, this channel appearance or disappear depends on the insulin. Any questions? So here is an example of the adipocytes. Here we have the GLUT4, and you can see that it transports glucose in, and it stores the glucose as the triglyceride. Insulin can also help liver to convert the glucose into the glycogen. So basically, that's insulin can help glucose to be stored. An important part is that insulin help our body to store the extra fuel into 3 cells: muscle cell, adipocyte, and the liver cell. So these are the 3 cells, and their glucose transporter. Muscle cells use what?
Oh, 2.
4. 4. Muscle cell use glucose GLT4. Adipocytes use GLT4. And the liver use GLUT2. So this one is insulin dependent. This one is insulin dependent. But this 2 is not insulin dependent. And in the muscle cell, glucose is stored as what?
Adipocytes. Glycogen.
Glucose. Say again?
Glycogen.
Thank you so much. And in the adipocyte, glucose is stored as
Triglyceride.
Triglyceride.
And in the liver, it's also stored as the glycogen, the major portion. Of course, it can also have some triglyceride, but major is glycogen. So this one summarizes it. And it's even though we don't have the final exam, and even though that we kind of like rush through it, but the key here is that they have these 3 cells can be affected by the insulin. They basically, the region store the actual glucose. Muscle use glucose transporter 4, GLT4 adipocytes, and the GLT4 is the transporter that is insulin dependent. All right. So beta cell also release another hormone called amylin. The function of the amylin is to suppress alpha cell, because we have the alpha cell, beta cell, delta cell, right? Beta cell release insulin, alpha cell release glucagon. These 2 are acting opposite to each other. Insulin will move the glucose into the cell, will store it. Glucagon, opposite, will move the glucose out of cell into the blood. So beta cell will try to inhibit the alpha cell's function. Otherwise, our body will have both activate and kind of counteract to each other. The way beta cell to inhibit alpha is to release amylin. So beta will release amylin to suppress the alpha cells. So that's a major function.
So this could be a classical example of agonist and antagonist.
That's right. Yeah. And the alpha cell release glucagon. So glucagon has function kind of opposite to the insulin. Insulin will store everything into our cell, not everything. Will store all the extra glucose into our cell. Store it in the muscle as glycogen, store it into the adipocytes as the triglyceride, store it as the glycogen in the liver. But glucagon is opposite. Glucagon is very much, has this function very similar, like the cortisol. These two, glucagon and cortisol, will mobilize glucose into the blood. So these two and cortisol will cause increase of the blood glucose level. And the last one is somatostatin. This one will inhibit. So we remember that we have the alpha cell, beta cell, delta cell. Beta cell will release amylin to suppress alpha. Delta cell will release somatostatin to suppress both alpha and the delta. So delta cell will release somatostatin to inhibit both insulin and the glucagon release from alpha and the beta. So that's the delta cell. And this one showing you these three cells relationship. So green is green light, red is a red light, and let's say beta cell first because the major one. Beta cell, the function of the beta cell is to release insulin, and that will, and also it release amylin. Amylin will inhibit alpha cell. Now, delta cell release somatostatin that inhibit beta and alpha. So that's why. And the alpha cell will release what? Glucagon, right? And the glucagon will cause the increase of the blood glucose level. And so it's very much like the cortisol. And the blood glucose level increase. When our blood glucose level increase, it will trigger the beta cell. So it will become a positive green light to the beta cell to release insulin. So that's why that alpha cell indirectly, it's not direct glucagon trigger the beta cell, but glucagon will cause the increase of the blood glucose level, and that will trigger the beta cell to release insulin. Any questions? So, all right. So this is the type 2 diabetes. The prevalence, it increased over time. It could be the diet, it could be the stress. Type 1, type 2 diabetes. Type 1 is the, it could be the, it's called juvenile diabetes, that the body has low beta cells. Beta cell is injured. Type 2 is the insulin resistance, that beta cell is healthy. It's just our body start to build the resistance to the insulin. So type 1 is the injury to the beta cells. It could be the genetic disease. It could be the autoimmune disease. The patient will, once it's birth, and the beta cell will start to get injured, but the patient may not exhibit any symptom until later life. And usually start to have onset 14 years old, so it's called juvenile diabetes. Type 2 is more adult onset, that you have the patient has the healthy beta cell, but due to the diet, lack of the exercise, stress life, glycemia will induce the hyperinsulinemia, and then then following the hyperglycemia. The hyperinsulinemia will have more insulin. Eventually, we'll move this glucose back to the cell. But in the end, we run out all these beta cells. We max out the capacity to produce the beta cell insulin. Then we have the hyperglycemia. So when the patient already exhibits hyperglycemia, it already passed this hyperinsulinemia phase. And here is just summarized of this glucose transporter. Just even though there's a lot of information here, but only these three you need to know. Glucose 2, GLUT2, it happens in the beta cell, in the liver cells. This is insulin independent. GLUT4 is insulin dependent. So go back to this figure here. This figure is good. I like this one. So like this one here. GLUT4 is hiding in the cell, and their appearance depends on the insulin. Only insulin is there, they show up, and to transport the glucose. Otherwise, they retract back to the cell. Another one is common one is the GLUT3. This one is in the neuron, but we actually didn't really talk about it here. So 2 and 4 are the major ones that you must know. And in the end, that the hormone has two types. One is the steroids. The other one is non-steroids. The steroids can enter into the cell. The non-steroids, this is non-steroid, example of non-steroids, has to bind on the receptor on the cell membrane because they cannot enter into the cell. So basically, you don't need to worry about this one, just this steroids and a non-steroid. The reason is that this one penetrate to the cell or cell permeable, and this one is not. And then this one has to bind on the cell membrane, a receiver in the cell membrane. So that's it. Any questions?